Hello, friends. February 7th is World Read Aloud Day. It's a day when millions of people around the world read aloud stories just to celebrate reading aloud and how important that is. So today we're going to share a couple of stories. The first one is Where the Wild Things Are, Story and Pictures by Maurice Sendak. And you probably maybe have heard this story before, but it's a wonderful story to read aloud. It's published by HarperCollins Books. The night Max wore his wolf suit and made mischief of one kind or another. And you see what Max is doing there? He's chasing the dog. So he's being a little, maybe not very nice. His mother called him Wild Thing, and Max said, "I'll eat you up." And he was sent to bed without eating anything. Max was acting kind of bad, wasn't he? That very night in Max's room, a forest grew. Can you see the forest in his room? The trees. See the moon outside the window and the trees around his bed. And there's Max, still in his wolf suit. And look how that forest grew. It grew and grew, and now you can hardly see the bed. You just see the trees and the moon outside the window. And it grew until his ceiling hung with vines, and the walls became the world all around. Wow, his room has turned into a forest, hasn't it? And an ocean tumbled by with a private boat for Max, and he sailed off through night and day. Can you see Max on his boat? And his name is on the boat, Max. In and out of weeks and almost over a year to where the wild things are. That's where wild things are. When he came to the place where the wild things are, they roared their terrible roars, and they gnashed their terrible teeth, and they rolled their terrible eyes, and showed their terrible claws. See, the wild things, they're pretty scary, aren't they? But Max said, "Be still," and tamed them with a magic trick of staring into their yellow eyes and without blinking once until they were frightened, and they called him the most wild thing of all. So the wild things are scared of Max. And they made him the king of all wild things. And now, cried Max, let the wild rumpus start. So they're having some kind of a wild party. Look at Max and the wild things, stomping around, howling at the moon, having a fun, wild party. Now they're hanging from the branches of the trees. Max in his crown and the wild things. Oh, and now Max is riding on the back of one of the wild things. What a wild adventure Max is having. Now stop, Max said, and sent the wild things off to bed without their supper. And Max, the king of all the wild things, was lonely and wanted to be where someone loved him best of all. Then all around, from far away across the world, he smelled good things to eat. So he gave up being king of where the wild things are. But the wild things cried, "Oh, please don't go. We'll eat you up. We love you so." And Max said, "No." The wild things roared their terrible roars and gnashed their terrible teeth and rolled their terrible eyes and showed their terrible claws. But Max stepped into his private boat and waved goodbye and sailed back over a year, in and out of weeks, and through a day, and into the night of his very own room, where he found his supper waiting for him. You see his supper here on the table? It was there waiting for him. And it was still hot. What a grand adventure Max had with the wild things. Where the Wild Things Are by Maurice Sendak. This book is Frog and Toad Are Friends, the 50th anniversary edition by Arnold Lobel, and it's published by HarperCollins Books. This book has several stories in it, and we're going to read one called The Story. One day in summer, Frog was not feeling well. Toad said, "Frog, you are looking quite green." But Frog said, "I'm a frog." "Today you look very green, even for a frog," said Toad. "Get into my bed and rest." Toad made Frog a cup of hot tea. Frog drank the tea, and then he said, "Tell me a story while I am resting." "All right," said Toad. "Let me think of a story to tell you." Toad thought and he thought, but he could not think of a story to tell Frog. "I will go out on the front porch and walk up and down," said Toad. "Perhaps that will help me to think of a story." Toad walked up and down on the porch for a long time, but he could not think of a story to tell Frog. Then Toad went into the house and stood on his head. "Why are you standing on your head?" said Frog. "I hope that if I stand on my head, it will help me to think of a story," said Toad. Toad stood on his head for a long time, but he could not think of a story to tell Frog. Then Toad poured a glass of water over his head. "Why are you pouring water over your head?" asked Frog. "I hope that if I pour water over my head, it will help me to think of a story," said Toad. Toad poured many glasses of water over his head, but he could not think of a story to tell Toad. So he tried walking outside, standing on his head, now pouring water over his head. Oh no, let's see what happens next. Then Toad began to bang his head against the wall. "Why are you banging your head against the wall?" asked Frog. "I hope that if I bang my head against the wall hard enough, it will help me think of a story," said Toad. "I'm feeling much better now, Toad," said Frog. "I don't think I need a story anymore." "Then get out of my bed and let me get into it," said Toad, "because I feel terrible." Frog said, "Would you like me to tell you a story, Toad?" "Yes," said Toad, "if you know one." "Once upon a time," said Frog, "there were two good friends, a frog and a toad. The frog was not feeling well. He asked his friend the toad to tell him a story. The toad could not think of a story, so he walked up and down on the porch, but he could not think of a story. He stood on his head, but he still could not think of a story. He poured water over his head, but he could not think of a story. He banged his head against the wall, but he still could not think of a story. Then the toad did not feel so well, but the frog was feeling better. So the toad went to bed, and the frog got up and told him a story. The end. How was that? "Toad? How was that, Toad?" said Frog. But the toad did not answer. He had fallen asleep. I hope you enjoyed this story, The Story, out of Frog and Toad Are Friends by Arnold Lobel.